Hello, I'm going to talk a little bit about pewter spinning, and in order to do that I'll give you a quick overview and then actually spin a piece of pewter and then talk in some more detail about the tools and the moulds and the way it's set up and so forth. The pewter spinning is essentially a process whereby a piece of pewter in a disc form like this is spun on a regular medium-sized wood turning lathe with no special adaptations, and we end up with a simple little utensil just like a wood bowl, and it's made out of pewter. And most of the things that I make are typically usable utensils. And what we're doing is, if you can show there's a mould which is fitted onto the chuck. The pewter is actually jammed between the chuck and the tailstock, and you will need a special tool rest, which, as you can see, is like an ordinary tool rest, but it has holes and pins which can be moved, that the typically tool which we would use is jammed against the pins which act as a fulcrum, and that will lever the pewter over the mould, as you will see later in the demonstration. And these tools are very similar to wood turning tools, but they are slightly different shape, and I will talk about those in detail later. The pewter is actually put against the mould, and then it's held against the tailstock, which has a revolving centre with what's called the follower. And you can see it's not exactly centred, so we centre it by eye and then use a piece of wood with it slowly rotating to get it exactly centred. I'm just adjusting the pressure of the follower so that the disc is pretty well perfectly centred, which it now is. And now I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on the disc to save it being not so much damaged, but the tool will actually pick up little tiny bits of metal if it's left dry. I'm adjusting the tool rest now to bring it back a little bit farther away from the spinning metal than if it was a piece of wood that was being turned. And I've got a pin which is roughly where you see it away, and I'm picking up a tool which essentially is the equivalent to the roughing out gouge of a wood turning job. And this is the basic tool, or one of the basic tools, in order to do the initial shaping. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press quite hard to start with, so it locks the pewter onto the mould, stop it from spinning off. And now I'm going to use that same tool to slowly dress the pewter over the mould, and the process involves not only moving the tool towards me like that, which is what you might intuitively think you would do to spread the pewter over the mould, but also to stop the pewter getting too thin. Amazingly, you can actually use the tool to push the metal rather as though it was a piece of clay or something like that, and you can actually find the pewter will flow under the impression of the tool backwards, so that you've got the same thickness right from the centre to the outside. There's quite a lot of force required to do this, so the lathe probably needs to be quite robust. I've probably spun a couple of hundred pieces of pewter on a Myford lathe, and it doesn't seem to have done any harm to it so far. The professionals that and still work in much the same way, but they're doing it all day, and the professionals use tools which are probably about 2 foot, so they're a bit longer than my tools, and they tuck them under their arm rather like that, and that, I think, enables them to apply quite a lot of pressure on the body, but I suppose also means that they're coming to less harm working day in and day out. But I don't find that very easy, so I'm going to just use my body just to push a little bit. So I'm now working the pewter backwards and forwards, making sure that tailstock is absolutely tightened. I'm going to increase the speed just a little bit. Now at this stage you'll find that because the diameter of the metal is being reduced, it can sometimes tend to buckle, and in order to stop it from buckling, or to take the buckle out, some spinners use what's called a back stick. So they're holding it in the left hand and working the tool against it. I find that quite difficult to do, and unless it's absolutely essential, I tend not to use a back stick. And I find that some professional spinners probably operate in the same way. Some will use a back stick quite a lot, others will hardly use it at all. And if I can get away with not using it, I will work like that. You see, as I'm working towards the outside, I'm moving the pin along. And you can see I've now got the pewter essentially pressed over the mould, but it's gone slightly out of centre. So I'm going to now use a typical wood turner's scraper, just exactly the same as you'd use for wood, in order to just trim the edge a little bit. And in order to do that, I'm going to move the tool holder in like that. You'll find that I'm going to lower the speed a little bit. Shavings will fly off. Unlike steel shavings, they won't do you any harm. I need to just increase the speed a bit. I'll now trim the end so it's running perfectly true, I think. I'm now doing the final bit of initial pressing, just shaping this end. I'm now moving to another tool which you can see, and this will take out the some of the bumps and hollows produced by the initial spinning action. I'll put a bit more lubricant on. You can see that the action is ideally just one sweep from the outside to the inside. Now, probably at this stage, a real professional spinner would say, "I've got that smooth enough to take the piece of pewter off the mould and then go for the polishing stage." But, but I'm going to use what's called a cabinet maker's scraper in order to do a bit more work. Okay, in order to do some finishing, I'm going to use what's called a cabinet maker's scraper. And this is a very simple piece of tool steel, which has actually a burr worked on the two long sides, and it actually has essentially a couple of sharp edges, and it's something that takes a little while to explain quite how I achieve that. It's in the books and so forth. If you want to know, ask me or look up, and I will just take a fine shaving to just remove some of the minor tool marks. I'm just doing a little more and taking a fine shaving off this end, which is a bit unusual. Whoops. These shavings flying around look a bit dangerous, but they're really quite harmless. It's soft metal, unlike steel, so I can easily pick them up, and if they fly into my face even, no harm is done. And I will keep these and explain what I do with them later. What I'll do now is to put just two decorative little grooves at the top of the piece of spun pewter, just for it's quite bland material without some very minor decoration. A couple of lines lift it quite a bit and I'm using just a very simple, it's really a wood turner's scraper, I suppose. Not quite sure what it would be used for other than the sorts of things that I'm doing on the pewter. I need to adjust this always just a little bit. It helps to have something to steady the tool, because one false move and you need to move it a little bit more. One false move is a bit difficult to repair. It's all done by eye. It's positioning. I think that's about right. Get them the same size. I'm looking at the opposite end. I'm going to. That's it. Let's finish that particular machining operation. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some wire wool just to start the polishing process. The professionals use all sorts of weird and wonderful materials for finishing. Some of it's rather messy. It's rather like having fine grades of sand and mixed up with oil or grease or something like that, which they use in the handfuls of rag. It's a bit messy for the hobby woodworker, so I'm starting off with just, this is 4 noughts grade wire wool. I could have done it with a J-flex. You can see there is a bit of a shine coming. There's still a few tool marks on the work. And I'm going to leave it about that, and then we will move over to the polishing rig. Well, not a very good line, is it? Oh, it's not too bad. I'm not sure that the professional spinners would be using this sort of coarse sandpaper to correct a minor problem, but I'm not a professional, anything like. The next process is to get a bit of polishing done, and what I use is a polisher, which is this mop here, and it's fitted on. Probably most wood turners would just simply have this fitting on their lathe. The professional workers, spinning workers, would have a special polishing machine which is much the same as a grindstone, but with this device on which these mops fit onto. And the first stage is often a mop which has got stitching on it, so it's really quite a solid piece of cloth, and with a compound that I bought probably 25 years ago, and I've forgotten the precise name. It's probably a Tripoli compound, and essentially it's an abrasive mixed up with a grease. And what you want to do is to make sure that the line of the motion of the polisher is a bit different to one when it was being spun, so that it should take out some of the minor scratches. You need to hang on to this piece quite strongly, because if not it will go flying across the workshop, and then it doesn't usually go into the operator, but it does go into. I'm starting to continue with the polishing process, and I'm just using a traditional softer mop. You can see this one's not stitched, and it's used for the final polishing in much the same way. With another compound which I bought 20 or 25 years ago, and I've forgotten the name of that, but it might be called Rouge or something. But it's an abrasive, a finer abrasive mixed up with the grease and so forth. So I'm just charging the wheel. And then going round in the same way as I did previously. It just produces a better shine. Show off some of the bits of pewter that I have made, and in order to set this in context, I've got one or two pieces I haven't made so that you can see the difference. And the first thing is I don't know what the origin of this, looks like a coffee pot, but it's made with pewter that's really quite dull, and this is the sort of pewter that was around until the mid 18th century. It has probably quite a lot of lead in it, which was found to be bad news from the point of view of the customers and owners drinking out of. So lead was essentially banned from pewter, and so the composition of pewter is now, and at the time it was called Britannia metal, and it's now, so Britannia metal is now essentially pewter, essentially tin, which has about 90% of the material. Antimony is typically 8%, and copper something like 2%. And the mix varies a little bit depending upon whether the pewter is made for spinning or casting, and on the particular preferences of the manufacturer. This is a modern piece of pewter. It's not been looked after all that well, but you can see the sort of shapes of a modern piece. Quite a difficult piece to make, because the bottom of it has to have a mould which is made in several pieces, well, typically 6 or 7, 6 segments and a middle bit, and one of the segments is parallel sided, so that can be moved towards the middle bit of the segment. The middle bit of the mould can be taken out, then the parallel sided segment can be moved to the middle, and that can be taken out, and then the others can all be taken out. So that's really quite a complicated process, and largely involves very skilled pattern making, I suppose, rather than pewter spinning. And then this is another ornament that was bought, modern Scandinavian piece. You can see this is a very high form, quite a difficult thing to spin, and in order to spin this, the spinner would have used several so-called breakdown moulds, whereby he would start off with a fairly flat type cone, and then a steeper cone, and then finally this final high shape. This little stem, I think, is probably cast and then machined, and the base is probably spun, and you can see how the end is rolled over to give it extra bit of stiffness. So that's the sort of thing that you might get commercially. A collection of various bits and pieces that I made just to give you some flavour of the sorts of thing that a relatively simple spinner can actually make. The first thing to notice is that this is a shape I made quite early on, and I deliberately made it to this shape thinking that not much spinning was required because it's a very flat cone. And interestingly, at the time I probably didn't really realise that if I used a piece of the mould made from a piece of yellow pine, which has very contrasting hard and soft grain, that the pewter would actually pick up the impression of the grain as it was being spun. And in the end I decided that although that was something that you're not supposed to do, it really gave quite a nice interesting texture. So I've used that in quite a lot of my pieces. This piece is made out of something which is probably 1.5 millimetres thick, so it's quite stiff on its own. This one, similar shape, made on the same mould, and the same impression of the wood grain, but you can see that the edge is rolled because this was made from pewter which is less than 1 millimetre thick, so it's not all that rigid. So and this is done with a lot of commercial modern bit tankards and so forth, that in order to stiffen up the edge is rolled over so that you get quite a stiffening effect. And although it looks as though it's a bit complicated, it's relatively straightforward to actually roll the edge over and either get a bead or a sort of flange. These two jugs are really quite difficult things to do, as I've explained, because you either need a carefully made mould which comes apart so it can be taken out, or you do what's called spinning in the air, so that you just have a mould which holds the bottom, and the concave bit of the pewter is actually just spun with no backing of a mould. So it's a rather more tricky thing, and is considered to be one of the epitomes of the spinner's art. I learned to do that quite a long time ago, and I'm not sure I could still do it all that readily. So these were made 14 years ago. The only bit of pewter smithing, for want of a better word, that I've done, this piece was made on a mould which is actually hemispherical in shape, which was made with my little jig that I use for wood turning, for making wooden balls and so forth. Gives quite a nice simple shape. And then the foot is actually made on a mould which essentially gives you a disc with a flange turned on it, and you cut the flange off, and that's that becomes the foot, and then you're left with a disc which you can either melt down, or you can make a smaller foot for a smaller piece, and then it's soldered on, which again is a tricky operation, because solder typically, as is normal, soft solder melts at a temperature which is not much lower than the melting point of pewter. The professionals use a blowpipe and are rather careful. I can't get on with that, and I simply use a hot air gun which melts solder, but not the pewter, because it's got an adjustable temperature, and little bits of solder put round the inside, the whole thing slowly rotated, load hot air gun on the outside, and suddenly the pewter all melts in a very satisfying way, runs underneath the foot, and leaves you with a very nice edge, which doesn't, or join rather, on the outside, which doesn't really need any work at all. Same sort of soldering technique to put a handle on this sort of dish. Combination of wood and pewter, this candlestick, the little thimble-shaped pieces done separately, and then on some it's soldered on others it's just had a hole in the middle and it's screwed down into the wood, taking this sort of wax collecting saucer with it. I think they look quite effective. And then I've actually used pewter as a sort of a disc, which is really just rammed on the top of this Banksia nut to make a bit of contrast. And I've used the same technique on this quite tall vase, I suppose, which had began to distort and to split. So this disc is just hammered on, rather like a steel band on a cooper's barrel, I suppose, hold the whole thing together. And just as a matter of interest, there's a crack which I've filled up to look pewterish, and that was resin with aluminium powder mixed in with it, and I think it works quite well if you like this sort of slightly rough made piece, as opposed to the precision engineered piece which we're becoming quite used to. And the thing about pewter is that we get lots of swarf, which or shavings, and I've collected up. Whoops! I've collected up a saucepan full here, as you can see, and this is just an aluminium. It's just an aluminium saucepan, and I can melt the pewter, which melts at about 250 degrees centigrade, and I can pour it into a simple wooden mould made out of, surprisingly, MDF, which will just charge a little bit, and then I can turn that as you would a piece of metal, I suppose, on a metal turning lathe, but this is done on a wood turning lathe with wood turning tools. And here's a little solid, it seems almost solid, cast pewter egg cup, but machined rather than spun. And this is the sort of machining that you might expect a model engineer to do, but this can actually be done on a wood turning lathe with standard wood turning scrapers. Okay, just a quick word about the moulds. Most of the moulds that I made are made out of wood, and here you can see a piece that was made out of yellow pine with this very pronounced grain on it, which actually will give an impression, quite a good impression, of wood grain onto the inside of the spun pewter. There's a similar one made out of ash, which also has a fairly pronounced grain. Professionally, if people are going to use wood, they would use a very hard grain, close grain wood like beech or maple. And here you see the one that I use for my candlesticks. And you can see when you look at the candlesticks that I managed to polish them so there's no impression of the that it was actually made on a wooden mould. And that's the sort of mould that I've used for the little bit on the candlestick that actually holds the candle. There's a piece that is very similar to the mould that I used today to spin that simple little bowl. Again, this is made out of a hardwood, very dense. You can just about see the end grain, but it's not very pronounced. And then, if you're really serious, you can make moulds out of solid nylon. And here's one I made as a hemisphere quite a long time ago. And this is really what you want if you're going for production, I suppose. If you're making hundreds, then it's probably worthwhile having a mould which isn't wood and doesn't leave the impression of the wood on the pewter. I bought this largely for satisfying myself as to what the difference would be, and I've used it a few times, but that piece and this piece, probably 15 or 20 years ago when I bought them, cost about £50, so it's something you might think twice about before making lots of moulds out of nylon rather than easily obtained bits of wood. I think that's all I want to say about moulds.